The world is waking up, and you finding your way here today is no coincidence. The spirit world always has a way of guiding us where we most need to be at the absolute perfect time. I'm your host, Lindsay Morlock, and you're listening to the Guided Podcast, where we explore how the spirit world works on our behalf to guide us along our paths. This is where you'll learn how to live a life that is both conscious and connected, so you can supercharge your pathway to healing and open to life's magic and miracles. Come along this journey to see how guided you truly are. Hello, everyone. I'm back today with another solo episode for you all. And today we're talking all about judgment. I have been navigating judgment in my own experience lately, and I think if I'm really honest, we're always navigating judgment to varying degrees throughout our journeys. But where I want to focus today is specifically on some of the ways that judgment infiltrates our experience and why it can create a more difficult journey. You know, when I think about this topic, I don't think anyone in our world is free from judgment. It's basically human nature to judge. And as a species, we're super judgy, whether we're talking about judgment that's derived from comparison culture or by way of marginalized populations, things like ethnicity, race, sexual orientation, physical ability, or even the ways we simply judge ourselves, from our pesky inner critic, also known as the ego, to scrolling through social media and comparing our lives against someone's picture-perfect Instagram vacation or Pinterest feed. Duality is part of the human experience. So right, wrong, good, bad, light versus dark. And as a result, judgment can feel pervasive. We're all going to have our own opinions and beliefs about a host of different topics. But you'll notice that there are people you can offer your opinion to, and even if they have a differing belief, they can meet you with a curiosity and an openness that really invites healthy discussion. And in the process, it becomes a really productive way of being in relationship with another person, where two sovereign people hold their own value and belief systems, and yet can still honor and respect that when people have differing views, it's just that. It's an alternate perspective. But our ego minds, that dualistic and fearful part of our brains, are what make us want to make beliefs right or wrong, good or bad. It's our inner critic that makes someone better than or less than someone else. And from a spiritual perspective, we all have these unique perspectives and gifts to share with the world. And we can all coexist with one another without having to hold the same belief systems. And we get to believe what we want about the beliefs and opinions about others as well. This is part of our free will. But our perceptions, or namely our judgments of these things, are what tend to create a lot of the problems for us, both within ourselves, with others, and within our society at large. So as I was thinking about this topic today, I was trying to look at the many faces of judgment. And in one respect, I can find a helpful use of judgment in that it comes in the form of contrast, where our conscious awareness of judgment within ourselves can actually help to point us in a direction of something that we want to heal, or in the direction of something we want to create in our lives. So for example, while it rarely feels good to pass judgment on another person, if we view someone else's life and assign value to something that they're doing as somehow better or worse than our own experience, that act of judgment provides useful information or feedback for us about where we are and what's happening in our inner world, and about something that we want to create or that we're desiring to have in our own lives. And I feel like that's a helpful example because one of the lenses we can use to examine judgment in our own lives is through something known as a mirror principle. Now, the mirror principle suggests that everyone and everything showing up in your outer reality is just a mirror of what is happening in your inner world. Now, sometimes these mirrors are just a direct reflection of what is happening within you. Other times, these mirrors are offering feedback about an old pattern that you might have healed and now are seeing differently. And in other times or situations, these mirrors might be reflecting something back to you in an indirect way. But any way you slice or dice it, the mirroring effect that happens is super helpful because it's always providing us with a real-time feedback loop that offers information reflective of where we are on our respective journeys at any given point in time. So let me give you an example of this. When I was in the process of getting the courage to leave my corporate job, I was sharing my news. It felt very exciting to me, and I was sharing it with a lot of different people. And some of the people in my life, and these were people who genuinely cared about me, often asked me questions like, well, have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? Have you thought about how you're going to do this? How are you going to do that? And every time I was asked a question, I got angry because I felt like they were judging me. And that feeling of judgment led me to create stories in my mind to the effect of, well, people clearly don't think I'm capable of doing this or making this move. People clearly don't think I'm responsible or have a good head on my shoulders. People must just see me as reckless or irresponsible and like I give absolutely no consideration to circumstances and consequences. Now, those were the stories running through my mind in response to judgment. But I do know from these individuals that their intentions were not to judge me. Their intentions were coming from a place of care and concern. And I know now that they were asking these questions out of that genuine concern. Or what I found out from other people as well is that they asked these questions actually out of a curiosity because they were contemplating similar moves for their own life. And they were trying to ask me to help them think through their option. But I couldn't see that at the time because I was so focused on the fact that I felt judged. So because I was triggered by these questions, that provided me with important feedback about what was unhealed within me. And I think it's important to share in this that the truth is I was scared about the things that people were asking me questions about. So the reason I was perceiving their questions as being judgmental was because I was questioning within myself whether I was making the right decision. I was questioning within myself whether I was being irresponsible. I was questioning within myself whether I was being reckless and whether I was making good decisions about the process, whether I had considered every single consequence that I needed to consider, whether I had planned effectively enough to make this transition. So because I was questioning all of these things within myself, their questions were just mirroring my own fears right back to me. So I share this with you because when we get triggered or activated by others, it's never about them. It's always about us. It always goes back to what's happening within us. And our egos love to play the blame, shame, victim game. And the ego loves to point the finger anywhere other than where we need to look, which is within ourselves. But when we do come face to face with what's going on inside of us, we have the opportunity to heal it and change it. So for me, when I placed my focus on healing my own fears around leaving my job, suddenly no one was asking me questions that I perceived to be judgmental. But here's the thing. The questions didn't change. It's not that they weren't asking me questions anymore. They were asking questions, but my perception of those questions is what changed. Because as I became confident within myself and as I became confident in my decision, I either didn't feel judged when the questions were asked, or what happened most often is people stopped asking me those questions altogether, and they started mirroring my own enthusiasm and excitement for the journey ahead. So when I believed in my decision, others mirrored that right back to me. So this is the frame out for my musings today, because as we move through our lives and contemplate the changes that we want to make or the things we want to heal, I believe there's a direct correlation between judgment and how gracefully and easily we navigate these changes. You know, I personally have been experiencing tremendous change in my life this past year. I've already mentioned in previous episodes that I transitioned from a corporate career to self-employment. I made a huge cross-country move. I'm in the process of building an entirely new life for myself. New friends, new hobbies, new doctors, new service providers. So much newness everywhere I look. Now layer onto this, I'm also making big changes in how I navigate the routines in my life. And that for me looks like, how do I take my spiritual work deeper? How do I align with a deeper level of spiritual being, which is a departure from the doingness that I usually approach my life with. And so while these are all great changes and have brought and will continue to bring many blessings into my life, that doesn't mean that navigating these changes have been easy. Quite the opposite, actually. These changes have come with a side dish of total uncertainty and this feeling of vast groundlessness. And I share that because so many of us deal with uncertainty. And navigating uncertainty and different transitions throughout our life can really test us. And for me, navigating this period of change has been one that has tested me to use every tool that I have in my spiritual toolbox. And as a result, not only have I had the ability to witness the full support of the spirit world and how they're showing up for me every day, but I've also become acutely aware of where I make this journey measurably harder on myself based on the way that I navigate change. And judgment has played a key role in that difficulty for me. So anytime I think my experience or I think my emotions or think that what is happening from one day to the next in my life should be different than anything other than what I'm actually experiencing, I'm in judgment of what is. I'm in judgment of what's happening. And this inevitably leads to suffering. Now, the degree to which we suffer over various topics in our lives differs, but judgment does induce suffering nonetheless, and it never feels good. And it's a choice that we make. So just like it doesn't feel good when other people judge us, it's just as damaging when we judge ourselves and our journeys. Our ego minds get high off of judging others and judging ourselves because it loves to make things better than or less than. It loves to make things right or wrong or good or bad. But our soul and the spirit world certainly does not and would not have us move through life in that way and with that lens. So for purposes of this podcast today, I mostly want to speak to self-judgment. You know, I'm someone who is and always has been really hard on myself. I've always had high expectations for myself in terms of my performance, my productivity, how I show up for others. You know, there's really no end to this list of how perfect I've felt like I've needed to be in order to feel worthy. Because when you struggle with feelings of not enoughness, your life becomes about doing things that constantly prove and allow you to feel that you are somehow enough. And how would we ever begin to qualify what is or isn't enough without judgment, right? So this is what I've been observing. You know, judgment is both a familiar friend and equally a total bully. In the book An Untethered Soul by Michael Singer, he actually speaks to this inner bully in a way that I really like, because essentially what he's speaking to is your mind, your ego mind, and he speaks to it in a way where he asks you to think about the voice of this inner critic as if they were your actual roommate, and as if this bully was a human being living in the room next door. And let's be honest, if this were true, I'd be moving out of the house with lightning speed, looking for new housing and looking for a new roommate. Probably wanting to live alone to not have to deal with another roommate, right? And yet, I know I'm not alone when I say internally within ourselves, we tolerate this behavior, this inner bullying all the time. And we don't even just tolerate it. We often help give the bully momentum. We give them fuel for the fire by identifying with the beliefs, with the judgments, and then fueling it some more. And when it tells us that we're not going to amount to anything, that we can't do something, or that we're never going to achieve whatever we want for XYZ reason, and we believe it, we are fueling that inner bully. We judge ourselves for not being enough. We judge ourselves for being too much, for getting it wrong, for failing, for not being perfect enough, right? The list goes on and on. So I want you to think about what your inner bully, what your inner critic says to you. You can hear the narrative in my own head, but our narratives shift based on our own wounding and what it is that we are here to heal within ourselves. So there's really no limit to it, because when it comes to judgment, there's no winning. There's always something to judge. And the more we believe our own judgments, the more we spiral downward. So judgments coupled with the misidentification of the judgments as truths cause a lot of inner turmoil and distress. So if you have a busy mind like I do, it's not to say that these thoughts are ever going to go away. My experience has taught me that the chatter does improve significantly when we actively work on it. However, we always have a choice in this equation. We have the choice to notice that the thoughts exist and separate ourselves from them so we can observe them, reserve judgment, and choose not to believe the narrative spewing those stories and shut it down completely. Or we get to decide to follow the negative spiral down the stairs of the Titanic together, right? It may be human nature to judge, but we get to decide whether we're going to lean into that judgment to understand ourselves for what the judgment is trying to lead us to escape from, right? What pain or fear it wants to distract us from, or whether we're going to buy into the lies and perpetuate the self-harm and potential harm to others with our own projections. And like most things, this really impacts our journey in both big and small ways. So one of the things I've struggled with in my own life, as I mentioned earlier, is navigating change. I've never been good at it. It's something I actively have to develop skills around managing every single day. And one of the biggest lessons I'm learning is that our judgment of ourselves and the process of our own evolution does not help the journey. Quite the opposite, in fact. So when we're judging our journey, it might look like you wanting to be somewhere that you haven't yet arrived. It might look like not accepting what is happening in your current reality. It might feel like things should be easier. It might feel like things are too hard. Essentially, if you're shoulding all over your experience, you're experiencing some sort of judgment. And when we're judging our experience, not only does it make us feel like we are somewhere we shouldn't be, it sends us into complete resistance in the process. And when we resist what is, nothing can change. And in the process, we inflict tremendous suffering on ourselves. So for me, most recently, one of the things I've been noticing is how I've been judging how I'm navigating through changes in my own life and the way things are showing up in my reality. And this is mostly happening in the form of judging my emotions at every twist and turn. So it probably wouldn't come as a surprise to you that I work hard on myself. I'm very committed to my healing. I'm very motivated by it. And I'm committed to self-improvement. And because of that, I can also be incredibly impatient when I don't see changes as quickly as I want to. And there's judgment about what the process should look like or how quickly changes should unfold in my life. And it doesn't make me do better. It just causes me to suffer along the way. And one of the things that process looks like, that process of suffering, right? Recently, I was telling a friend that I feel like spirit has been putting me through my paces with my own learning. And that's part of the experience. But the learning cycle that I'm currently in the midst of feels like it has me throwing gutter ball after gutter ball after gutter ball. And it can be incredibly frustrating sometimes. Now, the message of the emotion of frustration is about persisting. So while I understand that I need to keep at it and persist, my judgment of the situation turns making mistakes into a sign of failure. Now, spirit wouldn't have me see the situation that way. They have me see mistakes as a pathway to learning. Some of our most important lessons, in fact. They tell me that mistakes build resilience and resolve in our ability to believe in ourselves. They tell me that these mistakes ultimately help me tap into a deep well of strength that I often don't even know exists within me. But my judgment of the mistakes, of my perceived failures, makes the journey so much more painful than it needs to be in the process. And the judgment really sucks our energy along the way. And the irony is, we inflict this suffering on ourselves. I'm not hurting anyone in the process of making mistakes with the mistakes that I'm making. I'm just throwing gutter ball after gutter ball in my own life. But my judgment of my own journey inflicts far more suffering on myself and through the process than really is necessary. So it's something to really be aware of, because suffering is a choice, and allowing myself to judge the process is a choice to inflict suffering and harm upon myself. And the truth that we need to face anytime we're judging ourselves, if we're judging ourselves, we are absolutely judging others. None of us want to admit that, because we know that judging others isn't a quote unquote good thing, right? But if you're judging yourself, there's no way you're not judging other people. And so let me share how this plays out. For me, I used to remember telling people that I had really high standards for myself, but that I didn't hold others to those same expectations. And let me tell you something, that's crap, because while I truly wanted that to be the case, in practice, it really wasn't. And it's not that I was doing it consciously, but it showed up in subtle ways within myself towards others. So for example, high standards for me might have looked like killing myself to produce work in my corporate job for other people, right? I had high standards for my work ethic and my production and the quality of work that I produced. And I obliterated any personal boundaries in order to achieve a certain end product. So in terms of judgment, if others weren't bending over backwards themselves too, meaning they actually had boundaries and had work-life balance and were prioritizing themselves or their families over the work product, I was secretly judging them as not being as committed to the job as I was. And that's just simply not true. They had boundaries. I didn't. That's my problem, not theirs. But my ego wanted to make me right and them wrong through the use of judgment. My ego wanted to judge them as not being invested enough or caring enough. And none of those things were true about the people that I was judging. So my judgment about them was about me. It had nothing to do with them. It had everything to do with what is unhealed within me. And so anytime we find ourselves in judgment of another human being, we need to turn the tables back on ourselves and look at what that mirror is trying to show us about what is unresolved or unhealed within ourselves. So I guess you can look at it as that's the good news and the bad news. The good news is that we have control over ourselves and how we show up in the world and the responsibility we take for our healing. And the challenging news is that it's all about us and we have to take responsibility for ourselves and our healing. And so if you're sitting there kind of like, I don't judge, you're probably not being honest with yourself. I'm just going to say it because it's pretty much human nature to judge. How we judge might be more subtle for some than for others, but we're judging. And if judgment wasn't as pervasive, we wouldn't have a culture trying to fit people into boxes and placing labels on people in a way that makes them more or less unlovable in the eyes of certain people. Instead, we would be encouraging and celebrating authenticity. Can you imagine a world where the more you waved your proverbial freak flag, the greater the value society placed on you? And I'm hopeful that the more conscious and connected we all become, and the more that we work to heal ourselves, the more we can create a world that does celebrate that kind of authenticity. So remember, judgment provides us with a constant feedback loop about what we are not in acceptance of within ourselves. So whether we're judging someone else or we're judging ourselves or both, it's really important to remember that it always comes back to us. And if we are judging what someone looks like, how they're showing up, their work ethic, their parenting abilities, who they want to love, the color of their skin, right? Whatever it is that we're judging, this says absolutely nothing about the person you're judging and absolutely everything about something within you that is unhealed and calling for your attention. Now, I'll give you another example around this. When I make mistakes, no matter how big or small the mistakes I make are, my internal Richter scale acts like all of them are a total catastrophe. So whether I make a typo in a newsletter or I forget to order gas to heat my house in a timely manner, it all feels equally catastrophic in my body because I have a deep wound and fear around making mistakes that needs to be healed. But when I judge myself, and especially when I judge the process of healing this fear and this wound, if I don't have compassion and patience for my own mistakes, I'm not going to be able to have compassion or patience for the mistakes that others make either. So if I'm judging someone for not being perfect, that's all my issue. And I can be clear that it's my issue based on how my own body responds in reaction to making mistakes. I'm not perfect, far from it. And I feel like it's important for people to know that even though I'm deeply committed to this work, work, I'm still human, and I'm right there in the thick of this learning with you. Being conscious and connected to the spiritual realm doesn't mean that we don't face challenges anymore. That's why we come to Earth. That is the human experience, to grow and learn. And so there are always going to be challenges and obstacles along our path, because that's where we grow and learn the most. And there are always going to be levels and layers to our healing. But the spiritual tools allow us to navigate these challenges with more grace and ease if we choose to work them into our process. But if we choose to follow the path of judgment and we choose the path of suffering, our judgment of ourselves, of our circumstances, is going to also affect our alignment. Now, you're going to hear me refer to the concept of alignment a lot on this podcast, because there's nothing more important in our lives than our alignment. So what do I mean by that? Our alignment is how we feel. Are we feeling good? Are we not feeling good? When we're in alignment, we experience emotions like joy and excitement and happiness and passion and gratitude and appreciation. And when we aren't aligned, we're feeling things like sadness or fear or frustration or anger or self-doubt or depression, worry, right? Those lower level emotions. Our feelings are not good, bad, right, or wrong, but rather they are intuitive messages from our souls. So when we're in alignment, those feel-good emotions are telling us that how we're viewing our lives or a situation is aligned with how spirit would have us view the situation. It's like one big green light that tells us that we're on the right track to keep moving forward in that direction. On the other hand, if we're feeling those lower level emotions, or what might be considered to be more negative emotions, we're out of alignment and we're not looking at the situation the way spirit would have us look at the situation. Now, we live in a society that is largely allergic to negative emotions. We've been taught to avoid negative emotions like the plague. And by avoid, I mean to move away from our pain, to distract ourselves from the emotions that we feel, right? That type of thing. And we do that in so many different ways. But I feel like this starts really early on in our life too. Think of being on a playground, and maybe you notice that a child falls off the monkey bars only to fall and skin their knee on the gravel. And what's often the reaction of the adult supervising? Maybe they run over to the kid who's now distressed and they kind of brush off their knee and they're like, you're okay, right? Have you ever noticed how the kid kind of looks at the supervising adult quizzically in the moment, as if to be like, you're going to tell me how I'm feeling? Deep down, the kid is like, dude, I just fell and hurt my knee and now I'm bleeding and I really want to cry, but you're telling me I'm okay, but I don't feel okay. So what's the right answer? And it's a great example of how we disconnect from our emotions and invalidate our own experiences, or how inclined we are to want to distract ourselves and distract others from pain. And now I agree that marinating in our pain isn't what we want. That's not the pathway, but our pain does need to be validated. It needs to be felt in the body and released. And I find that this too is so linked to judgment, because it's like we allow others' judgment of our experiences to mean more than our own lived experience. And in the process, we discount, we discredit, and we invalidate our own experiences because we judge that they should somehow be different than what they are based on how someone else is judging our experience, or based on some preconceived notion that probably stems from some false belief that we adopted at some point in time along our journey. Now, having these behaviors or beliefs is just part of the journey, but the conscious awareness that we bring to them can dramatically alter how we show up for ourselves, how we show up for others, and how much grace and ease we allow ourselves to navigate through our own process. Based on the content of this podcast, you might have rightfully assumed that judgment is a problem for me, particularly self-judgment. And as someone with a strong ego mind, the negative self-talk for me has not just been an inner critic that honestly seems too benign. It's been an inner bully my entire life. And while I used to believe that the pathway to self-improvement required me punishing myself as a way of growing, I now know that that could not have been more wrong. And I inflicted a ton of suffering on myself, and still do at times, admittedly, in the process, because I misidentified my self-judgments as personal truths. I believed my own BS. And while those judgments certainly had or have messages for me, actively engaging in self-judgment judgment was a pathway to bondage, not to freedom. Judgment is a part of the human experience, but the spirit world doesn't judge our experiences. In their eyes, our experiences here on earth are just that. It's just experience. But our reptilian brains place a label of good, bad, right or wrong on these things. Spirit would just have us see it all as experience without the judgment. And some of our experiences for sure are fueled by love, while some of our experiences are absolutely fueled by fear. And yet they still remain just that. They're all experiences. Experiences that propel us in a specific direction, and hopefully in a direction that helps us return back to our true essence of love. But there's no judgment from the spirit realm. The humans, we do all the judging all on our own. So how do we navigate our way through it? For me, my primary way through all of this is with a combination of responsibility and compassion. So Spirit's message for me around judgment is often that self-punishment, and in this case, it was in the form of self-talk, right? That self-punishment was reprehensible in the eyes of love. And yet, when we have a strong ego, we can sometimes fool ourselves into thinking that we have to endure that type of behavior within ourselves in order to create change and self-improvement. Now, pain often does create change and self-improvement because we're so motivated by our pain. But I know I was misidentified with punishment as a pathway to self-improvement for years before I was really able to see the truth. And for me, part of the truth required taking responsibility, taking healthy responsibility for my behavior, for my choices, while also meeting myself with compassion through the process. So you can think of compassion as it's caring about yourself enough to relieve your own suffering. And experience has taught me that we cannot hold ourselves in both compassion and judgment simultaneously. Compassion requires that we withhold judgment. It requires us to meet our experiences, especially really hard moments and hard emotions, with this total presence and total acceptance of what's happening inside. And when judgment is in the fold, we actually resist our experience of what is happening in the present moment. So instead of allowing ourselves to feel disappointed by the things that may be happening in our lives, for example, perhaps we're judging the disappointment because we know we should feel grateful based on our actual reality. But invalidating our experience of disappointment doesn't help. It's just another way we pass judgment onto our lived experience. But when we instead take the approach of allowing all of our emotions to be valid, allowing ourselves to be fully present in the moment with whatever is coming up, that's when we create the space to allow that energy to change. If we can allow what is the attention that it needs and meet those emotions with compassion and a curiosity for what's trying to be revealed for healing within us, somehow the pathway back to a place of true understanding and alignment starts to emerge. And this is one of the reasons that a meditation practice can be so beneficial. Meditation asks us to still our minds long enough to notice the chatter. It doesn't ask us to judge the chatter. It just asks us to notice what the chatter is. But being able to step back and be witness to our thoughts, to just notice the thoughts, is a really powerful practice with benefits that extend throughout our daily life. But when we have thoughts and judge them to be true or false, to judge them to be right or wrong, good or bad, when we place that value judgment on those thoughts, that's when we start muddying the waters. That's when our egos get activated and starts to pick up momentum. But when we look at these thoughts and just take them at face value without assigning judgment, we also have the ability to see the truth in all situations. And truth often looks very different than the meaning our egos assign to them. And one of the most consistent truths that I discover when I reserve my own judgment is that I have a lot of thoughts, but I am not my thoughts. And there is great power in disassociating from thoughts, especially negative ones. And that truth allows us to take healthy responsibility for the changes we want to make while helping us navigate through them with more grace, ease, and patience for the process. I know for me, no matter how many times I remind myself of the truth about judgment, it's something that I need to bring conscious attention and awareness to every single day in order to bring about change. Self-judgment infiltrates my own lived experience in more ways than I can count at times. And honestly, the deeper the wound, attuned, the greater the judgment I feel. And in those moments, I have to remind myself that whatever is coming up is all okay. It's all just feedback. Now, that doesn't mean I'm running around trying to project my judgments onto others, but the awareness of my own judgments and the healing that is being called for through those judgments always leads me down a pathway of finding the truth within myself. And I find that the more I can meet myself with kindness and compassion and curiosity in the process, the easier it is for me to move through the hard emotions, the easier it is for me to see the truth of the situation and to heal whatever it is that needs to be healed. And this is what then prevents me from going out and projecting judgments onto others and out into the world. That ripple effect that we have in our own little corners of the world are incredibly important. And by examining our judgments and what needs to be healed within ourselves, we have the ability to influence the positivity that we put out there. And our own journeys can unfold with so much more grace and ease along the way when we're not causing drama out in the world because we're managing the drama that's getting stirred up and created within ourselves as a result of these judgments. So I'll leave you with this question to ponder. Where do you find that you're judging yourself or maybe judging others? And what is being called to heal as a result of these judgments? And if you're having trouble seeing it, ask the spirit world to show it to you clearly, and I have no doubt they will. Because remember, they're always guiding you along your journey. Thanks for listening today. I hope this was helpful, and I'll look forward to talking to you next time. Thank you so much for listening to the Guided Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, I would be so grateful if you would share it with a friend or even leave me a review so we can ensure that it makes its way into the ears of listeners who need to hear these messages most. Until next time, may you remember how guided you truly are.